were using a cyclotip to treat herpes infections. We were told to inoculate microorganisms so that he would resettle his gut, treatment with amino acids and various supplements, casein and gluten-free diets were arranged, secretin, steroids, intragam and plasma exchange because it was an autoimmune disease, cranial manipulation. There was a real vote for chelating these children and even the use of a Lupron to monitor or alter their male hormones, sonar, which was an ultrasound treatment to the skull. And you could even buy online your own hyperbaric chamber to put your autistic child into. One of the big things that happened in the early 1990s was facilitated communication. Many children with autism, as you know, would not be able to speak. They had major problems with language and language development. And so Douglas Bilkin invented this facilitated communication. Interestingly, he was an Australian who established himself in the United States in 1990. As you'll see is the case with the vaccines, the media got hold of this and it went prime time in the United States in 1992. And a year later, there were more than 1,000 people trained in this process of facilitated communication. And basically, the trained person would hold the autistic child's hand and be able to interpret what the child was thinking and be able to recite what the child was thinking. A year later, multiple cases of sexual abuse of children with autism reported through this process. Families were broken up, etc. Finally, it went to the courts, and a very smart judge did an experiment where he actually sat the facilitator and the child with autism at a table, but put a board up between the two of them, and so that the child and the facilitator couldn't see each other, and equally they couldn't see what each was being presented with. And it became fairly obvious that the facilitator was reporting what they could see and not what the child could see, and that they didn't work. Bilkin's response to this was facilitated communication was a matter of trust that is broken by the rigour of a confrontational situation such as a trial, and the technique only worked when it wasn't being tested. The next thing that happened was the secretin issue. Secretin's a hormone reduced from the pancreas that reduces bowel secretions. And a young boy called Beck underwent a gastroscopy and colonoscopy to investigate for his leaky bowel and association with autism. And his mother noticed about 10 days later that his language seemed to improve. Dateline ran this story in 1998. Within 3 months, 2,000 American children were on secretin. They had to build special places to make the amount of secretin to meet the demand. The price went through the roof. People were being charged up to $8,000 to administer 4 doses. In 1999, a randomised trial was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed while children on secretin improved, the improvement was far greater on saline, indicating that this was a placebo effect. It just shows how when you don't know the cause of a condition, all these sort of treatments can appear, and desperate parents will follow whatever is available, even if there is no scientific evidence for it. That leads me to Andrew Wakefield. Now, Andrew Wakefield was a gastroenterologist working at the Royal Free Hospital who had a track record linking measles and Crohn's disease that he published in 1995. He had to retract these papers in 1998 when they could not detect measles RNA in Crohn's disease specimens. Around that time, he published in the Lancet a series, I think, of 10 children with pervasive developmental disorder, which is a feature of autism, and published that they had ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia and non-specific colitis. And he hypothesized and then subsequently published evidence of PCRs to suggest that this was due to the measles vaccine. Between 1998 and 2002, he became a media darling. There were over 1,500 articles published on Wakefield. He had numerous TVs, real celebrity position. And in parallel with this, vaccination rates in the UK plummeted from 90 to less than 70%. And children in Ireland and the UK, for the first time in many years, died of measles. Now, he had a supporting cast at this time. There was a character called John O'Leary who ran a lab called Unigenetics in Dublin, who published his measles virus PCR research to show that Wakefield's specimen had a positive PCR. In Utah, there was a character called Vijendra Singh who published work showing high measles virus titers in the blood and CSF with children with autism, and also demonstrated anti-brain antibodies. Ken Aitken was a Scottish psychologist who did some work and published a paper showing a series of children that he followed as cases regressed following the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine. And Walter Spitzer, a retired McGill epidemiologist, showed that regression could occur up to 1 year after the vaccine. John March, who was a vet in the UK who had a child with autism, made comments about the combined vaccine in animals. Kingsburn and Menkes were two US neurologists who reported supporting Wakefield's view on a review of their own children with autism. And Kriegsman was a New York gastroenterologist who published a series of 40 children with inflamed guts who had ASD. Now, Brian Deere was a Sunday Times investigative reporter who started on the hunt of looking at Wakefield's work and the subsequent work of a lawyer in the United Kingdom called Barr. And in pulling apart Wakefield's work, he found that Wakefield never got ethical approval for any of his colonoscopies or LPs. He failed to identify the fact that one of his funding sources for his research was a personal injury lawyer by the name of Barr, who I'll talk about again in a minute. Deere claimed that, in fact, this personal injury lawyer had also referred some of the children to Wakefield for the study, and Wakefield had not declared this. But Wakefield misrepresented the timing of the onset of symptoms in the gut, the onset of autism, and the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine. In 2004, following Deere's report in the Sunday Times, the Lancet notified the BBC, and this led to a retraction of the original paper. The Lancet notified the BBC that, firstly, the other authors or Wakefield's co-authors were quite shocked because they were not made aware by Wakefield of his funding sources by this lawyer. And indeed, Wakefield, the other authors all retracted their participation in the paper. Wakefield mentioned at that time that 5 of his children were indeed clients of this fellow called Barr. They indicated that the paper hypothesised but did not show a causal link between the vaccine and autism. There was a lot that subsequently came out under freedom of information about the activities of Barr and some people that he was funded, and I'll go to that in a second, along with the vaccine court. So when they pulled apart the story, it turned out that in 1995, Wakefield met a lady called Rosemary Kessick, who had a child with autism. And Kessick approached Wakefield because of his work with measles and Crohn's disease and raised the question, could the vaccine have caused her child to have autism? Kessick's approached a group in the United Kingdom called JABS, which stands for Justice, Action and Basic Support, and it's an anti-vaccine group, a bit like the lobby that we see in Australia. JABS referred her to Richard Barr, who was a personal injury lawyer. Now, Barr had been a lawyer around that time with the breast implants and had messed up the case with the breast implants and missed out on the big payouts. It turned out that Barr had received $30 million from the Legal Services Commission. Now, the Legal Services Commission was a $1 billion authority in the United Kingdom for lawyers to obtain money in order to undertake research necessary for proving their cases. He built a scientific and medical investigation team. His legal firm kept $20 million of the $30 million, and $10 million was to fund various researchers. His medical and investigation team did not include anyone on the board of it that had any significant scientific background. In 2004, following the exposure by the Times, he was denied further funding and their court cases were withdrawn. But it's very interesting to see where his funding went. He gave Andrew Wakefield $800,000. He gave John O'Leary, who ran Newton Genetics in Dublin, who did the measles virus PCR, $1 million. Ken Aitken, who was the psychologist who published Regression Post-Vaccine, he gave $400,000 too. And the fellow actually was previously, up to that time, publishing that it was due to an intrauterine exposure. Spitzer, the McGill epidemiologist who also published regression studies, he gave $30,000. The vet who raised questions about the vaccine in animals, he gave $180,000. The US neurologist who supported Wakefield, he funded $800,000. Kriegsman, he funded $30,000. And there were also some people who will come up in the Mercury part of the story he funded as well. So you can see that the whole issue of the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine was built on a false case supported by lawyers who had an interest in building a case against the vaccine companies, and in fact there was nothing to link the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine to the development of autism. Furthermore, in the vaccine courts, it turned out that within Wakefield's own lab, the guys who did the PCR refused to participate in the study because their PCRs were negative. And Wakefield was fully aware that they did not demonstrate any evidence of the measles vaccines on the PCR. The group from Dublin, Unigenetics, who he did use and were funded by the lawyer, actually had a lab with terrible quality control, and it turned out that their PCR bits were very close to where they stored bacteria and would have had major issues of contamination, that his false positives and false negatives seldom worked, and that half the time he was detecting DNA when it was an RNA virus. So it was all a schmozzle, and the whole case against the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine involving Wakefield and others was built on a falsehood through lawyers' supports who were trying to build a campaign to sue the vaccination companies. Now the story is rather similar for mercury. In 1999, the person who was the head of the CDC became very nervous all of a sudden about the amount of mercury that young children were receiving, because all of a sudden they realised that the 6 vaccinations, children were receiving 150 micrograms of ethyl mercury, and that there were no EPA guidelines for the appropriate exposure for a child. The guidelines do show that that amount of mercury exceeded allowable fetal exposure. However, the fetal exposure represented methyl mercury. Now, methyl mercury is not excreted and accumulates in the body, while ethyl mercury, which is used in the vaccines, is excreted and does not accumulate in the body. The environmental methyl mercury exposure, that's the methyl, which is the bad version that's considered still, that any child has is 400 micrograms in the first 6 months. So 150 micrograms from the vaccine is quite small compared with the environmental exposure, and the vaccine form was of ethyl mercury. Furthermore, the symptoms of autism, or the features of autism, are quite different from mercury exposure. There was a kind of biological experiment of this in Japan in Minamata Bay, where methyl mercury was dumped into the bay in an illicit manner by a company concentrated in the shellfish, and the local community saw a lot of neurological toxicity. The neurological toxicity was quite different to autism, and they did not see any increase in children diagnosed with autism in that community. However, as a consequence of the CDC reports and things that happened, methyl mercury was removed routinely from vaccines in the United States in 2001. However, some parents copied on to the CDC comment, and 2 parents, Lynn Redwood and Sally Bernard, published a paper in Medical Hypotheses saying that autism was similar to mercury poisoning, and they started a group called Safe Minds. Now, Medical Hypothesis was a little local rag with an authorship or readership of 300, but because it was published with no peer review, suddenly it was felt to be credible. A guy called J.D. Hanley, who was a millionaire with a child with autism, then started Generation Rescue. And he had a number of B-grade Hollywood actresses that were supporting him. He created these autism angels who led a brigade of chelation therapy for children with autism. And amazingly, by 2005, in the absence of any evidence, more than 10,000 American children were being chelated for their mercury exposure that caused their autism. Hanley would engage in amazing intimidatory aspects if anyone questioned the link between mercury and autism. So he would threaten scientists, he would send emails to scientists, etc., and saying, we know where you live, we know where your children go to school, if any of them made comments about the mercury chelation. He hired a PR firm that had previously been involved in the Dow Chemicals breast implant litigation. Another guy from a PR firm and no medical background published a paper, Evidence of Harm, in 2006, again linking mercury to autism. And he came up with other sources of mercury beyond the injections, including release from Chinese coal, California bushfires, and even increased cremations with the mercury from the amalgam in teeth being released into the atmosphere and poisoning these children. He published this when the rates of autism didn't go down after removal of the mercury from vaccines in 2001. There were also some scientists who released a couple of studies. Richard Deck, did a study where he got malignant nerve sheath cells and bathed them in aluminium, alcohol and mercury, and it showed that it affected the methylome synthetase that could be saved by B12 therapy. His research was funded by Safe Minds and was used to point out that mercury does damage the nerves, and it led to a vote of giving these children lots of B12. Another scientist called Maddie Horning had an autoimmune model for mice, and on injecting them with mercury claimed that autistic traits developed in the mice. Again, she was funded by Safe Minds, and no one was able to reproduce her work. Robert Kennedy, who was a member of the Kennedy clan and disgraced himself with drugs, had to do a lot of voluntary legal work, but in 2005 he published an article in Rolling Stones attesting to the link between mercury and autism. At the time, he was working for a legal firm that had expertise in mass tort reform. This brings me to two characters who came up regularly on the internet when Andy was little, David and Mark Greer, and a lot of the parent-based autism websites would bow to these guys. They were getting their literature out big time. Now, David Geer was an obstetrician who in 1987 set up Medcon, which was a consulting service for lawyers and plaintiffs suing vaccines. In 2000, Richard Barr hired him to testify about mumps, measles and rubella in the UK. Barr was that lawyer I mentioned with Andrew Wakefield. So suddenly he discovered there was this potential marketplace around vaccines and autism. In 2003, he published an article linking the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine to autism. In 2004, he used the VAEA database, which is a vaccine database which reports adverse events reported by doctors and various other people. And he postulated a link between neurodegenerative disorders and mercury vaccines and heart disease that he published in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons. Now, again, this is a journal published, or was a journal published out of a site in Toledo that was had no peer review and was published with a very small circulation. But again, it was taken by gospel, particularly by the parent lobby groups who would then create lectures and push this line that the mercury in vaccines was causing the autism, and you had to send your hair off and do chelation therapy. He did a study of chelation plus Lupron because he thought by inhibiting androgen release he would reduce or enhance the release of mercury in circulation so that it could be better chelated. It turned out it had taken patents on the use of Lupron in this particular person. He had a review board established that had no scientific people on it. I think his wife was on it, some friends, etc. In 2003, ironically, he made the statement that the first step in this process is the immediate removal of mercury from all vaccines, which we will predict will result in an end to the autism epidemic. He published that in 2003. Subsequently, the epidemiologists started looking at this. In 2003, there was a report from the Swedish and Danish databases about the prevalence of autism. Now, the Swedes had removed mercury from their vaccine in the early 90s, and they found that the rate of autism had continued to rise despite this being removed from the vaccines. In 2004, a UK study actually found that the more mercury children had from vaccines, the less likely that they were to develop a neurological disorder. In 2006, an epidemiologist in Canada found that the highest risk cohort of children for autism are those who did not receive mercury in vaccines. And in 2007, a guy called Bill Thompson published in the New England Journal an extremely detailed review of 1,000 children and found absolutely no correlation between the amount of mercury that they received and any subsequent neurological deficit. In 2008, they saw that the rate of autism in California had continued to rise despite the removal of vaccines, mercury from vaccines in 2001, proving that the Geers who had made a statement in 2003 that we would see the rates fall were wrong. And in 2009, there was a vaccination court run in America. What they found in America was a number of politicians, particularly right-wing Republican politicians, got behind the vaccination or anti-vaccination lobby and pushed this really hard. It led to a court case which was quite shambolic. And the court case, the families who presented their cases at the court, when the videos of the children before and after vaccines were shown, the autism experts were able to clearly demonstrate that the children had autistic features before they had the vaccines. And And we had the case of that Nicholas Chadwick, who was a researcher in the lab of Wakefield, had negative PCRs that Wakefield had denied. So the vaccination course had all thrown out, and it was very much clear at the end of this time that mumps, measles, rubella vaccine and indeed mercury had nothing to do with autism. Unfortunately, through all this period, the rates of vaccination plummeted. Children died of mumps and measles, and children died of chelation. And so it's all built on a falsehood. It was a combination of some researchers who had taken out patents on testing for measles, which Wakefield had done. They'd taken out patents on single vaccines, so just separating the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine out into single antigen vaccines to begin rather than the triple antigen. They'd taken out patents for that, who were funded by lawyers who wanted to sue vaccine companies, created the illusion that the vaccines were responsible in the hope of making significant personal benefit. And in fact, when the science came to play, there's never been any link between vaccination and the rising prevalence of autism that we've seen around the world since the 1990s. So that's the story, and I think it's fairly clear that there's no link to vaccines. Now, this is the fellow on the left, Leo Kanner, who first described autism or pervasive developmental disorder in 1943. And the picture on the right is a guy called Donald T, who was one of the original children that were described in his first series of children with autism in the 1940s. NBC, or one of those American lines, about 3 or 4 years ago, found this fellow Donald T living in a small community in America. And he had a wonderful life. He was very eccentric, but he got married, he worked, and he played golf socially with a group of friends that he was very close to. And it's interesting to go back and see Leo Kanner's original description in that paper, because it's really been known since 1943 what causes autism. And Kanner described in his paper, which was entitled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, in 1943, a description of 10 children with a new neurological condition. They had limited language, stereotypical and repetitive play, excellent memory for lists, they lacked imagination, they had a concrete interpretation of what was said, and they regarded people as unwelcome intruders, and he came up with the word autistic to show self-absorption. He also described their parents and noted similar personality traits in their parents. Their parents tended to be cold, bookish, formal, introverted, humorless, detached, excessively rational and objective. Now, I hope none of you think that that's me from the fact that I have a son with autism, but it goes to the fact that the disorder is genetic. We don't understand the genes. The genes are very complex. There are multiple genetic abnormalities that will probably result in an autistic traits in a person. It's fascinating to postulate around the features of autism, around communication and social awareness. What is it that actually leads to us being wired to innately develop these skills? And I think as we understand more of the neurological development, we'll eventually unravel what are the genes that are out of filtering people with autism and what do they control, and hopefully that will lead to treatments. But it just goes to show that we've known for a long time it was the genes, and that vaccines don't have a role to play. Now, I want to follow up by talking to you about what does work for young children with autism, and that's intensive early intervention. Australia has best practice guidelines that were published in about 2005 and updated recently, and these were based on an evidence-based review. And they make the point that these children should be diagnosed as early as possible and then undergo intensive early intervention for a minimum of 20 hours a week for a minimum of 2 years in an autism-specific program. The program requires the children to be assessed comprehensively beforehand, leading to the development of an individualised education plan that can be delivered in a home or centre-based manner, but with peer support wherever possible, and that the program should be structured with supportive teaching environment and a very high staff-to-child ratio, between one staff member for every 2 to 4 children. With respect to the behaviours that are frequently adverse in these children, they need to be functionally approached. This is the process of behavioural analysis, where what causes a bad behaviour is analysed, understood, and then tactics are used using behavioural therapy techniques to extinguish the adverse behaviour and produce positive behaviours. This is the approach of positive behavioural support. that these programs need to be delivered by autism specialised therapists, teachers and assistants, that there needs to be family participation but also family support and importantly family respite, that it needs to be a team-based approach, and that there needs to be systemic assessment before, during and after completing the program. The children need to have an autism-specific content that teaches joint attention skills, play and imitation. They need to build language. So the two important things for these kids is we've got to be able to get them to communicate, and we've got to manage their challenging behaviours, because if we don't get them communicating, we don't manage their behaviours, they can't learn. We need to teach them how to interact socially and to be confident about social interactions. We need to teach them living skills. We need to manage the sensory issues. We need to be the kids to be able to generalise their strategies from what they learn in the program to the rest of the world. And as mentioned, we have to manage the adverse behaviours, the meltdowns, etc., that these children show, because they're a massive barrier to family functioning, but they're also a massive barrier to these children going forward in the education system. Now, when Andy was diagnosed in 2002, there were no such programs. You really had to do a home-based intensive behavioural program where you hired your own therapist. They were very expensive. They were affordable to the few. They were very invasive on family life. And there was no objective reporting or research documenting outcomes. So what we did was we bought this old church in Maruka and we converted it into a childcare centre, and we hired a teacher and a speech therapist and occupational therapist, and we set up this organisation called the AEIOU Foundation. Now the name comes from the vowels. The vowels represent the challenges that these children have with language. And the pink A to the 4 blue letters is the 1 girl to every 4 boys who are diagnosed with the condition. The program itself, sorry, I clicked over a slide there. So we opened up the first centre in Maruka. We now have a network of centres in Queensland. So we have a centre in Townsville. We now have centres in Bundaberg, Harvey Bay. We have a centre at the Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, a number of centres in Brisbane. There's a centre in Toowoomba. We were running a rural program in Emerald, but this has shut down because of funding. But we've got a really fantastic and very exciting proposal before the government at the moment for one in Western Queensland based out of Toowoomba that will be delivered in partnership with Good Start, the early childcare provider. We're just seeking funding from the government and the coal seam gas industry to develop it. In addition, Autism Queensland centres in Rockhampton and Gladstone, Mackay and Cairns. So Queensland is very well supported in this area compared with other states. The AEIOU program, the children are enrolled in groups of 10. They receive 25 hours of intensive early intervention a week, and they have 50 hours in the actual centres itself because it's long day childcare, so it provides parent respite. It allows parents to work or engage in some of the social opportunities they otherwise would not be able to engage in if they had to look after these children all the time. Each group of 10 children has a full-time teacher, 2 teacher aides, a behavioural therapist, and then across each centre there is a therapist team consisting of a speech therapist, occupational therapist and psychologist delivering a transdisciplinary approach. The program is play-based. It tries to operate very similar to how a kindergarten would work, but each activity builds the skill set, particularly language, behaviour and all the skills that we said these children need to learn. The children will work with one-on-one. This top picture in the left-hand corner is an illustration of a text program, but you can see many other things where we use to build engagement with the children and teach them the skills they need to learn, but also to behave, concentrate and engage at the time. We also do small group sessions, as mentioned, play-based, and we do group activities. And this is a great illustration of teaching these kids how to brush their teeth. With our behavioural therapists, our success in toileting these children, certainly in our Nathan Centre, we're getting 90% of children toilet trained within 3 months of entering the program. So, as I said, if you can get these kids to behave, you can get them to communicate, they build skills really well. And you can put them on a different pathway through life and dramatically change family situations and family functioning. We also take them for trips. This is our Toowoomba base for kids, and I see we've got a lot of the Toowoomba GPs here. And this is them visiting the Air Force Base at Oakhead. You see these beautiful kids, and they're having a ball, they're engaging with people very well. These are kids who couldn't be taken out of their homes at the start of the program because of the meltdowns that they had. Now, we have prospective research. We've been doing very detailed outcome-based research on a group of kids in our Nathan Centre. And what we've seen is significant improvements, highly significant improvements in their social communication, Similarly, on the Mullen score, these are age adjusted, so very statistically significant improvements on visual reception, fine motor receptive and expressive language. So we know that, I've got that down twice for some way because I'm very proud of it. So we know the program works. The program's expensive. For us to deliver it, it costs about $46,000 a child, with the biggest cost being the staffing cost, which is 76% of the cost, because we have one staff member for every 2 children. We've done a cost-benefit analysis, and even with modest improvements in ability to attend mainstream school, and we're seeing about 75% of our children transitioning to mainstream against a benchmark of 20% based on IQs when they enter the school. Minimal changes in their ability to work, so the ability to work an increased percentage working part-time, a small increase in the percentage working full-time at the minimum wage, and reduced care needs. We provide a dramatic lifetime cost saving of $1.3 million. So it's an area of worth investing. And even though early intervention costs $100,000 over 2 years, we estimate that the benefit cost, that is the benefit for each dollar spent, sitting at about $12. So it's a very useful thing for governments to invest in because of the long-term cost savings. If we can invest in early intervention and then transition them into a skilled system that is focused on providing them with the skills to enter the workforce and to gain independence with respect to living. We set our fees along with the mission statement of making the program affordable. We charge families $24,000 a year, but they get back from that childcare benefit, childcare rebate, helping children with autism. So for a family, the bottom line of this table is a family on an income of $40,000 a year. These families get back over $9,000 from the childcare benefit, $7,500 from the childcare rebate, $6,000 with helping children with autism, and their out-of-pocket costs are covered by the carer's allowance. So we set our fees where the carer's allowance on a fortnightly basis pays every cent of the program. We find that low-income families in this situation have a massive trouble managing their money. So in order for them not to get behind, we've set things up so that they can direct the carer's allowance every fortnight and all costs are paid. The second bottom line shows a family on the average wage of $70,000 and their out-of-pocket costs are covered by the carer's allowance, carer's bonus and the child disability allowance that every family gets. Now, given that these children are attending for 50 hours, that's 50 hours of respite, we feel a program that's delivered at a cost of no out-of-pocket cost to a family on the average wage is a very effective thing to deliver. We receive $12,000 from the federal government. We have to raise $10,000 for every child through fundraising. We're hoping one day that NDISs, etc. cover this, but we're not too sure with what we've seen so far. We have a lot of fundraising programs. 104600 is a business program that leads to $10,000 sponsorship, to $40,000 worth of government funding to create a $50,000 place for a year in the program, and a lifetime cost saving to the community of $600,000. We also do take a hike, and our Toowoomba and Gold Coast take a hikes this year. We're massive. We have over 100 people at the Gold Coast, and the idea of take a hike is people walk 40 k's with the option. It's a day's walking, so it's a day in the life of a family, with the option to carry a 15-kilo pack, which is the weight of the child average age of the program. You'll see the guy in the top left-hand corner wearing a green mankini. He owns AEIOU Pharmacy and got an extra $2,000 to wear a mankini for the entire walk. He took his top off for the last 10k, and as you can see from his bill, that's not a pretty thing. My wife runs a foundation called the Lynn Wright Foundation. This raises money to support costs of living for low-income families, so it fills their car with petrol so they can get the child to the centre. It replaces washing machines, all those sort of things that families on low income struggle in this setting. This is our Nathan Centre. It was our first purpose-built centre at Griffith University. And we learned a lot from this building project that we'll extrapolate into future centres. For example, we had to excavate a lot of land that led to big walls, retaining walls, and we found children who wouldn't normally draw would suddenly draw on the walls. So we now incorporate drawing walls into the centre, and a key feature in future centres will be a central observation room so people can come and watch the program, researchers can record without actually interfering with it. Plus, we now have an online curriculum that's close to being developed, and we'll look to build central observation rooms that can use ultra-fast broadband through the National Broadband Project so that we can deliver rural programs and overcome the adversity of distance. That is, how do we get specialist therapists to rural communities? The final slide is that the location of it on the university has led to Griffith University building an Autism Centre of Excellence. And this is about training teachers to work with children with autism in the classroom. So now with Griffith's education, all teachers do an autism module. They have Australia's first special education program where it can be directed purely at autism. In most programs, autism is an elective subject. And they have a graduate program for existing teachers to go back and get autism training. We've got over 100 teachers and other people from the community doing that graduate certificate at the moment. There's a Masters of Autism, Master of Education, PhDs, etc., and this is getting very exciting. The program is generalising across Griffith University, so we hope to see vocational education and criminology adopting an autism unit, and ultimately we hope to see that Griffith University becomes an autism-friendly campus. That's my last slide. In summarising, I hope I've demonstrated to you today that the whole vaccine issue was built on false science, developed by self-interest groups who stand it to profit from demonstrating a link between autism and vaccines and indeed mercury. And I hope this empowers you when you see a family that are nervous about having their children vaccinated because they might get autism, that it's based on corrupt data and there's no truth in it. And I've just advertised to you a service that is available. We have 200 children currently in our program around Queensland, 160 staff. There are real outcomes being produced by these children. We're taking them onto a different pathway through life, and this is what can be achieved provided that we can get adequate government funding to reach all. And that finishes my talk today, and I'll be very happy to take any questions as required. And my next talk I want to do to you is actually about haematology in the new world of targeted therapy, but that will follow at another day. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions that anyone has on the chat side? So Rebecca's asked, how early can children enter the AEIOU program? The AEIOU program is for children aged 2.5 to 6, and the reason for that is childcare licensing. So from the age of 2.5, what we find is that we've got quite big wait lists by the end of the year, and then I think at the end of this year we're transitioning 120 children into school. So the program, there's a bit of a wait list that develops at the end of each year, but by the following year, early in the year, there are lots and lots of spots.
Yes, thanks, James. Ken Murphy from GP Connections. As a parent of an autistic child myself, I certainly found it very interesting and certainly absolutely support your thoughts on early intervention. That's absolutely essential. Just a reminder to anyone that you know, can type a question in the bottom left-hand screen there. And if we, you know, so there's been a couple coming through, that's great. If no one else has any questions, just once again like to say thanks very much to James, very much appreciated. And if we have any further questions that come through later that you think of, we'll certainly pass them on to Dr. Morton and get his feedback. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.